Hey everyone, in today's video, I'm going to be going over my top 10 best weapons to use in Elden Ring. So let's dive right into it. Coming in at number 10, we have the Royal Greatsword. It's honestly really good when it comes to regular enemies since it's a colossal sword. The attacks are just going to stun lock majority of the bigger guys, allowing you to get off a full combo for free. Then the Ash of War on it, Wolf's Assault, is also pretty good with its damage. Your character does a flip, stabbing the sword into the ground and then leaving an explosion behind. Now, the reason I put this weapon at number 10 is half of its damage is magic based, meaning when you hit an enemy, a certain amount of physical damage is taken away because of armor. The same can be said with magic attacks having magic resistance, so it's basically like hitting an enemy with 2 layers of protection. It does have a high attack power on it to help make up for that, but still it falls behind. Another issue I found with the sword is the Ash of War on it does do a good amount of damage, I'll say that at the very least. However, it doesn't have a lot of range to it, so you have to be up close to your target, and it takes a long time for the second part of it to go off, which is half of its damage. I'm not saying it's bad, there's just a bunch of other weapons that are much better, like the next one, Ruin's Greatsword, coming in at number 9. Very similar to the Royal Greatsword with both being colossal swords, so you're going to get that same effect when it comes to dealing with regular enemies, stun locking them with basic attacks until they drop. The part that separates this from the number 10 slot is firstly, the damage on the weapon being almost completely physical, so there isn't a second element to it that would reduce the total amount of damage we can throw out. Secondly, it's got the best scaling in the game, having an S in strength, so you can go all the way and max out strength for the most basic attack power, since the Ash of War in it mainly depends on the weapon's level to do more damage. Speaking of that, I think it's also better than the Royal Greatsword's Ash of War. With this one, your character raises the sword into the air before smashing the ground and leaving a wave of destruction. It really matches the name of the Ash of War, Waves of Destruction. You don't have to be up close with your target, and it's got a decent area of effect to it, just making it much easier and safer to land. Now, the only downside to it is you are doing a bit less damage for the exchange of being safer from a distance, which I think is well worth it, because even if you are doing good damage up close, if you die, it all means nothing in the end. And the next weapon on this list covers this even better. Number 8, the Falling Star Beastjaw. This one's not a colossal sword, but a colossal weapon. So it's like a colossal hammer, I guess, if it's not a sword? Anyways, the basic attacks will still be able to stun lock majority of the enemies like before since it is a colossal weapon. And similar to the Royal Greatsword, it's got a mix between physical and magic damage, which we know isn't the greatest thing out there, except the Ash of War on it makes up for it entirely with how powerful it is. Gravity Bolt. Your character raises the weapon, calling down what can only be described as a small airstrike on whoever you're aiming at. Now, what makes this stand out more than the Ruin's Greatsword is the Ash of War almost never misses. It comes down in an instant, blowing up whoever. Aside from this, it costs less mana to use and it can be casted rapidly for back-to-back uses. You just end up dropping a barrage of strikes on a boss that pretty much never miss. Ending with this, let's jump to number 7, the Blasphemous Blade. This one's going to be the first greatsword on the list, and because it's a greatsword, it still has somewhat of a stun lock effect when you're basic attacking enemies, just not as effective as the colossal weapons. So in some instances against larger opponents, they can break free of it and swing right back, which does mean you have to be a bit more careful with this weapon instead of just doing a full combo with ease. Even the attack power on it does fall off a bit in comparison to the colossal weapons, especially with it being a mix of fire and physical damage. With both of these negatives, it's hard to see it being ranked 7th on the list, but the passive buff and the Ash of War that come with this weapon make up for it so much. You'll understand why it's above the others. So the passive on it restores 4% of your max health and an additional 40 health for any enemy that you kill, and that's half of it. The other half is you gain 10% of your max health back, plus an additional 150 health for each enemy you hit with the Ash of War. Not kill, just simply touching them. And the Ash of War on it, Taker's Flame, is literally the exact same thing as the Ruin's Greatsword Ash of War. The only difference between the two is the Blasphemous Blade does more damage, costs a little bit more mana, and it does fire damage instead of magic. So if you hit multiple enemies with it, which wouldn't be difficult at all to do, you can regain at least a quarter of your max health easily. You become pretty resistant to death. Now the next weapon on this list is the complete opposite. You don't become resistant to death. You hand it out extremely quickly, killing anyone that's caught near you in just seconds. Number 6, Magma's Sacred Spear. It does have one thing in common with the Blasphemous Blade. Its damage is split between physical and fire. However, Mogwin's Sacred Spear is one of the larger weapons in the game, so it's going to have a stagger effect that's on par with the Colossal weapons, just keeping the larger targets stun locked for a full combo. On top of this, the spear comes with a passive amount of blood loss that can also be increased by leveling up Arcane, so when you are throwing out those basic attacks, you'll have a good chance of proccing a bleed buildup for even more damage, and if you have your build set up correctly, it can reach a much higher attack power than the Blasphemous Blade, so you're just going to be doing more damage in general. Then for the Ash of War, same thing. You're going to be throwing out way more damage, except you don't get that nice healing factor that the sword has, but you won't really need it with how fast enemies die around you. That being the Blood Boon Ritual. Your character raises the spear into the air, stabbing above him 3 times, with each one doing tons of damage and building up a lot of blood loss. You can usually proc a bleed buildup each time you use the Ash of War, which is just going to melt majority of the enemies around you. Afterwards, it buffs the weapon, giving it an extra 30 fire damage for 20 seconds. Nothing crazy, but every little bit does help out. So the only problems I came across with this weapon is when you are using the Ash of War, your character becomes completely static. You're not going to be able to dodge any attacks at all, so there's a really good chance you're going to take a hit right back when using this. And secondly, the range on it isn't anything special, so you'll have to be fairly close to your target to get this off, which just goes back to the first issue of getting hit right back, since you're going to be fairly close to your target if you don't kill them in one go. All around, it's amazing having good damage, bleed buildup, and being able to hit multiple targets, but its lack of mobility definitely held it back from getting higher up on the list. Next up, we have number 5, the Scavenger's Curve Sword. This pretty much does everything Mogwin's Sacred Spear can do, but better. Just like before, if you have a build set up correctly, these can reach a ridiculous amount of attack power, much higher than before, proc blood losses with almost every other attack, and you're always mobile. You're never really locked into one position for a long period of time. To be more exact with this weapon, I'm talking about if you use the Occult Affinity on it with the Seppuku Ash of War. This is not only going to give you lots of physical damage and blood loss, but it pairs amazingly well with this weapon because if you do wield them, whenever you do a jumping or running weapon art attack, you swing the swords 4 times. Combine this with blood loss and other items that increase your damage with rapid attacks, you melt almost anyone in front of you. Now, the reason I keep saying almost is because when you are dealing with enemies in the game that are completely bleed resistant, you lose a lot of that damage that comes with bleed buildups. Even though you can still reach a good amount of attack power, it's part of the reason it holds it back. The other part of it is since it's a curved sword, you don't get that stagger effect at all in comparison with the larger weapons. So when you are dealing with non-boss enemies, you have to really pay attention to dodge their attacks instead of keeping them in a stun lock, which is effortless to do. Whereas the next weapon on the list can handle every enemy in the game regardless if they're resistant to bleed or not. Number 4, the Giant Crusher. This thing is a monster. Being in the Colossal weapon category, you can throw around all the regular enemies in the game easily. Now, there's a couple of things to this weapon that make it better than the Scavenger's Curve Sword. Firstly, it being able to stun lock most of the enemies in the game. Secondly, you can use the bleed variation on this to proc blood losses just as well as the Scavenger's Curve Sword, and when you do come up against enemies immune to bleed buildups, you can switch the affinity on it to heavy, which gives it an S scaling in strength, taking the physical damage to a whole nother level. And lastly, this weapon can break a boss's stance extremely easily by doing the jumping weapon art attack. Literally, in just 3 hits, you can bring most bosses down to their knees with the correct setup. I have no doubt about it that this weapon belongs in the number 4 slot, one of my personal favorite weapons for obliterating targets. Anyways, I didn't put it higher up on the list just because this requires you to be right up close to your opponent, which again isn't a bad thing with how strong the Giant Crusher is, but there are other weapons that can get out similar amounts of damage from a distance much more safely, like number 3 on the list, the Sword of Night and Flame. I'm going to skip right to it. The Ash of War in this thing is still extremely powerful even after all the nerfs it's faced, and I am talking about the magical laser beam one. It has no problem at all blasting bosses or strong enemies with tons of damage. What makes this better than the Giant Crusher is the fact that you can stay at a distance to get almost the same amount of damage off, and you can use the Ash of War rapidly since the animation doesn't take too long. Now the downsides to this weapon are pretty bad to the point where if it didn't have the Ash of War it wouldn't make it on the list at all. The first thing is the damage is split 3 ways between physical, magic, and fire. So the basic attacks are going to be reduced by quite a bit, so you'll definitely want to have a second sword in your offhand to counter that. The other reason is the same thing as a Scavenger's Curve Sword. It's not going to be able to stun lock enemies with its basic attacks, so you'll have to be more mindful of dodging hits. It may be a bit annoying having to be more careful in the game, but when you can blast people with a full-on magical laser beam, it kinda outweighs that by a lot. Anyways, continuing on, we have the second best weapon on this list, the Bolt of Grandsax. Right off the bat, it's a spear-styled weapon, so it's going to work really well with shields, and even just by itself or power stancing it with another spear is going to make quick work of most enemies in the game. Yes, the damage on it is split between physical and lightning, so the basic attacks won't do as much, and it won't stagger enemies either. Still, not as bad as a Sword of Night and Flame's basic attacks. However, just like it, the Ash of War in this thing is even better than the magical laser beam. Ancient Lightning Spear. Your character turns a spear into a red lightning bolt before tossing it at the speed of a bullet with the range of a sniper. Safe to say, it's going to do a lot of damage. An added bonus to this is it can be charged up to travel further with more damage as well, which means you can also use Godfrey's icon on top of the Shard of Alexander to boost its damage even further. Again, with its range, you'll be able to stand at the back of a room during a boss fight, chucking lightning bolts like your Zeus. The only downsides I could find to this weapon are the usual suspects: split damage and no stagger effect. Coming to the number 1 spot for the top 10 weapons in all of Elden Ring, with this being the Dark Moon Greatsword. There's so many reasons why it's amazing all around, starting with it being a greatsword. We still get that stagger effect when attacking enemies, not as consistent as the bigger weapons, but much better than the smaller weapons like spears and straight swords. The next reason is the sword passively comes with 55 freeze buildup. It's not a lot, but you can proc freeze on the more difficult bosses and enemies, which can be better than bleed in certain instances, cause bleed takes a chunk of their health away, whereas frost does the same thing but a bit less damage, and it makes that target take 20% increased damage for 30 seconds. I'm not saying frost is its main damage, but it's definitely a nice passive effect on it. Then the main reason it's the best is because the Ash of War on it. Moonlight Greatsword. Your character buffs the weapon by adding an extra 65 magic damage to it, an extra 15 frost buildup, and turning your heavy attacks into projectiles that have medium range and a wide area of effect, all while lasting for 60 seconds, and this only costs 32 mana as well. So if you use the heavy attack, let's say 3 times in the span of 60 seconds, which you'll definitely swing more, but I'm just hugely underguessing it to be safe here, that comes down to almost 10 mana per projectile you shoot. That is extremely cost effective, if not a little bit overpowered, and there's a few more things to it as well. The weapon has frost buildup on it, and this applies to the projectiles as well, so you're not only going to do tons of damage with it, but it also stacks up frost while you're at a distance. Next, since the weapon depends on heavy attacks, you can charge up your heavy attack to do more damage and break a boss's guard extremely easily, like as quickly if you were using 2 Giant Crushers. And finally, since you can charge up the heavy attack, both the Shard of Alexander and Godfrey's icon increases the damage as well. There's so many reasons why I think this is the best weapon in all of Elden Ring, and the only downside to it is split damage with magic, but let's be real, there's so many pros to this weapon that hardly does much to it. Well, that covers everything for today's video. If you agree or disagree on my choices or feel like another weapon should have been on the list, let me know in the comment section down below. So before I end this, I do want to give a big thanks to the members of my channel for supporting me on my videos and the future ones to come. Thanks for watching everyone, and I hope I see you all in the next one.